Great, Boker Tov. We're going to be studying the laws of Hanukkah. We have the Rav Melamed's Pnei Halacha book in English. The title of the volume is called Zamanim. What does Zamanim mean? Times. What does it mean? The English subtitle is Laws of Minor Holidays and Annual Observances, including Rosh Chodesh, Tfirat Omer, Yom Ha'atzmaut, fast days, 3 weeks, Hanukkah and Purim. So we have Hanukkah and Purim together with, some people might call them the minor holidays. What makes Hanukkah and Purim minor as opposed to Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated? That's right. It's a rabbinic holiday as opposed to the biblical holidays. And we're going to learn a little bit about that. It's quite innovative of the rabbis to establish a new holiday. The holidays we have from the Torah remain the primary holidays, but there are these additional days. And the Talmud already mentions that these are additional festivals by the rabbis. Purim, we find in the Tanakh. Where? Megillat Esther. The whole story tells about what happened and how afterwards all the Jews accepted to mark these days. Hanukkah doesn't appear in the Tanakh. There's some hints here and there, but not the story of Hanukkah. Which happened first, Purim or Hanukkah? By how many years? Thank you. Purim, of course, was in between the first and the second temples, right? The Persian Empire, at the beginning of the Second Temple era, the Persians allowed the Jews to come back to the land of Israel, and but the majority stayed in Babylon, which was then under Persian rule. So that's the Persian king, Achashverosh, from the Purim story. And then when does Hanukkah happen?
Maybe 250 years later?
More than 300. More than 400, actually. Towards the end of the Second Temple period. The second half of the Second Temple period. We're going to get into the dates a little bit later. But so it's hundreds and hundreds of years later, the story of Hanukkah. And so by this time, it could be that the Bible was already closed, canonized, as they say, by Ezra and the 120 men of the Great Assembly. And so there's no book about Hanukkah in the Tanakh. There are 2 books called the Books of the Maccabees, which are known, they're part of a group of books called the Apocrypha. They appear in some of the New Testament. They have the Old and the New Testament together in one volume, and they have a section called Apocrypha, which is external books, additional books, which didn't make it into the Tanakh. The one we have about the Maccabees, that tells the story of Hanukkah in some detail. It's not exactly the way the story is told in the Talmud, but there's a lot to learn about the historical events surrounding the story of Hanukkah, and then the spiritual meaning, obviously, we're going to take from the Talmud. But that's a later book. The version we have is actually the only extant version was in Greek. Greek becomes the language of the land of Israel. After Alexander the Great, who conquered the entire world, including the Middle East, famously in year minus 333. So, and then the Greek was translated into Hebrew. There's the book of the Maccabees. We can read it in Hebrew. We can read it in English. And it doesn't have the status of a holy book, but it's fascinating historically to hear the stories and how the various battles We have also external sources which tell us about the Hanukkah story, external even to that book of the Maccabees. We have from the Romans who lived not long after. So we know a lot about the events, and the rabbinic side about how this became a festival. We don't have it written like we have in the story of Esther. At the end, it says the rabbis and all the Jews accepted upon themselves to make this holiday. Hanukkah, we have all that in the Talmud. Now, this is also interesting. We don't even have in the Talmud a standalone book about Hanukkah. About Purim, there is. About Purim, there's a book in the Tanakh, and there's a Masechet called Masechet Megillah, which talks primarily about Purim and Megillat Esther. About Hanukkah, we don't have a book in the Tanakh, and we don't even have its own section, Masechet, in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was hundreds of years even after Hanukkah was established. After the events of Hanukkah, you would think that by the time the Mishnah is written, after the turn of the centuries, maybe 150, 200 years after, 300 years after the Hanukkah is being celebrated by the Jews, you'd think it would get its own Masechet. We're going to see there's a few suggestions made as why the sages, primarily led by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who created the Mishnah, the foundation of the Talmud, why he did not give Hanukkah its own book. Hanukkah doesn't get its own book, not in the Tanakh and not in the Mishnah. It's discussed in the Talmud, like the Talmud, we said it many times, is actually quite stream of consciousness, you could say. We go from topic to topic. Even though Masechet Shabbat, you'll have topics about the laws of purity and impurity and the laws of Sukkot in the middle of the tractate that's about Shabbat. So there's a lot of associative discussions. And so we have the laws of Hanukkah galore, pages upon pages of the laws of Hanukkah in the Talmud, but not in the Mishnah. It doesn't have its own book. It doesn't have its own book. So we have to gather. We're hunter-gatherers. We're collecting. We're mining the tradition. There's an additional book called Zmanim. Yeah, there on the left. On the left. Is that Zmanim also? Perfect. Great. And I think those books are going to follow Yosef. Just prop them up a little. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Okay. So, remind us your name again. Chanoch. This is, what's your name? You forget too. Okay. Something in the air today. Shmuel, Chanoch, and? Idan means times, right? Aramaic. Idan is an Aramaic word. It's in Hebrew. It's used in Hebrew. Many Aramaic words are used in Hebrew, yeah. Chol Idan v'Adan. It's used primarily in Idan, was that like judge or? It's like actually, there's an I in there, so it really changes it. It's a different word. It's more like Eden, I would say. Garden of Eden. But Idan means time. Time. Or a period of time. Like, epoch. Let's call you epoch. We'll call you Enoch, and we'll call him Epoch. That's it. Chanoch and Idan. And Binyamin, introduce yourself.
He knows me.
Oh.
My memory is like...
That's it. So that's why we have to say it again.
Here is me, not you.
Is me?
He's the old one.
He's the old one.
Me.
That's it, okay. Me. Binyamin. Menachem, that's easy. And
That's easier.
Chanoch from Miami. We'll catch up. Hopefully, we'll meet you later today. We'll talk in person. We just started the laws of Hanukkah, chapter 11 in this book about Zmanim, about the minor holidays. So it's a collection of sorts because we don't have a book of the Bible, we don't have the book in the Mishnah, we don't have a book in the Gemara directly called the book of Hanukkah. There is the book of Maccabees, but it's not part of our rabbinic tradition. So what we have is a few pages in Masechet Shabbat, believe it or not. In the middle of Masechet Shabbat, there's a few pages discussing the laws of Hanukkah. Anybody know why? Why would it be there? What's the connection between Shabbat and Hanukkah? I mean, there is a Shabbat in every Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is 8 days, and so obviously one of those days is going to turn out to be Shabbat. Sometimes 2 days, even. Not this year. This year is just one Shabbat Hanukkah, but that's not why. Why is, what's a common halacha between Hanukkah and Shabbat? Candles. Candles, that's right. We have Nerot Shabbat and we have Nerot Hanukkah, and so the Talmud associatively, they compare between the laws of the Hanukkah candles and the laws of the Shabbat candles. The laws of the Shabbat candles we just learned about a month ago. When we started to learn the laws of Shabbat, that was one of the first topics that we covered, one of the positive mitzvot of Shabbat, to light candles. We said it's the Chavod Shabbat, or maybe even also there's an element of Oneg Shabbat. 2 concepts we learned about, rabbinic, or actually maybe based on the verse in Yeshayahu, so that may be more than rabbinic, it may be called Divrei Kabbalah. Anyways, there's a mitzvah like Shabbat candles, and so too we have a similar concept as a mitzvah like Hanukkah candles. Major differences between the 2 of them, major differences. The commonality of candles is quite external. That's what we're going to get to the bottom of that. Try to understand how they're different halachically, how they're different in terms of what we do, and what the candles are supposed to do, supposed to function as. We'll see all those details, Bezrat Hashem. But much of the material here is called from Masechet Shabbat. It doesn't have its own book. You just have to know that if you want to look up the laws of Hanukkah, you have to go to Masechet Shabbat. Until you got so there's no book in the Bible about Hanukkah. There's no book in the Talmud, Mishnah, or Gemara about Hanukkah. Where's the first time we actually have a standalone book, a section of laws talking about Hanukkah? It's going to be after the Talmud, in some of the poskim, some of the later writers who made up their own system. Who do you know made up their own system? Didn't use the Talmud system of dividing it into 6 sections, and Shabbat is one of them, but there's no Hanukkah in them. Who made up his own system? That's right. The Rambam has actually a book called Zmanim. He's the first one that had a book called Zmanim, which talks about holy times, holy days. And in there he said, here are the laws of Hanukkah. To be a little more precise, he puts it together with, there's 4 chapters, he puts it together with Purim. These are the laws of Megillah veChanukkah. 2 chapters about Purim, 2 chapters about Hanukkah. But that's the first time we have a book, standalone book where, okay, here are the laws of Hanukkah. If you want to look up the laws of Hanukkah, great, open up to the laws of Hanukkah, makes sense. Before that, for maybe 1,000 years, Jewish people talked about Hanukkah, practiced Hanukkah, had traditions about Hanukkah, had laws about Hanukkah. But if you wanted to find them in the literature, you'd have to be quite the scholar. You'd have to know that it's hidden within pages 21 to 25 in Masechet Shabbat. Nowadays, of course, we have other literature based on topic more that gives Hanukkah its due. And here we are. We're looking at the book called Zmanim, and in there's 3 chapters about Hanukkah. Straight on. Okay? Ready to go? Ready to go, Yisrael? Yosef? You get upset when I call you Yisrael? No. You know why I call him Yisrael?
His brother?
Yes. His brother is Yisrael. Yeah, I know his brother over 10 years. How long has your brother been here?
7 years.
7 years only? Wow.
Question?
Yeah.
The Masechet Shabbat, it's Bavli or Yerushalmi? Both?
Yeah. Masechet Shabbat is part of the Mishnah. And then there's Talmud that discusses the Mishnah. And many sections of the Talmud is discussed both in the Talmud Bavli and also in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Some sections only have Talmud Bavli, some sections only have Talmud Yerushalmi. But the majority of Talmud has both Talmuds about explaining the Mishnah. Yeah. Good to go? All right, Yosef.
The enduring holiday of Hanukkah. The Talmud describes the story of Hanukkah, which occurred during the Second Temple era, in a brief passage. When the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein. When the Hasmoneans prevailed and defeated them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil that was marked with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was performed there, and they lit the menorah for 8 days with this oil. Another year, these days were designated a holiday with the recitation of Hallel and Thanksgiving.
Pretty much that's it. That's all it says from the Mishnaic era about Hanukkah. One passage. Not a whole book, not a whole history. It primarily focuses on this miracle of the oils lasting for 8 days. And it says on one line at the end, these days were designated a holiday with Hallel and Thanksgiving. Okay, from here we have to expand. We're going to discuss why it's just such a small mention in the Talmud, but that's the starting point. As you can see, it comes from Shabbat 21b. That's in Masechet Shabbat, and this is a Braita, which is a quote from the Tannaitic times. And there's also one other mention in a book. It's not part of the Talmud. It's like an adjunct. Just like, what did he say? That there's the book of Maccabees, which is an adjunct sort of to the Tanakh. So there's also a few small Masechtot which are called Masechtot Ktanot, which are an adjunct to the Talmud. One of those, of course, is Megillat Ta'anit. And there it says, you're not allowed to fast or deliver eulogies on the days of Hanukkah. That's it. That's all we have in the primary sources, about the first primary sources, Tannaitic sources, about Chanukah. Okay, now the rest is pieced together from various sources, including history books, including the Book of the Maccabees, including the Talmudic, the sages' interpretations. So let's get into it and see what this is all about. Go ahead.
It is likewise forbidden to fast delivery in these days. The sages established many holidays during the Second Temple era. Thank Hashem and rejoice over the salvations He performed for Israel. These holidays are mentioned in Megillat Ta'anit. Many of these holidays commemorate the victories of the Hasmoneans. 30th Adar was Nicanor Day, when the Hasmoneans defeat a large Greek army and killed their commander, Nicanor. 14th Sivan was the day they conquered Caesarea. 22 Elul, when the Hasmoneans killed the apostates who refused to repent. 23rd Mar Cheshvan, when the Hasmoneans destroyed the brothel that the Greeks had built near the Holy Temple. And 25 Mar Cheshvan, when they conquered Samaria and began the settlement.
Wow, so there's actually 5 holidays. Good morning, Israel. There's actually so many holidays that we don't celebrate. But they're there in a book called Megillat Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit, as I told you, that's a very ancient text that we have from Mishnaic times, even pre-Mishnaic times, where they make a list of Second Temple holidays. What month are we in now? If you know it off by heart, you don't have to have a page. If you have the page, you can bring it out. You know the song? Chanoch, this is for you. You definitely get a copy. Everybody else should have one. If not, they should have it in their head. The months of the Hebrew months of the year. You can look on. You can look on together. You know it off by heart. First month of the Jewish year is called Nisan. Join me. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shvat, Adar. So what month are we in? We're in Kislev. Okay, Kislev is month number 9, as you can see. We have here one column for the biblical holidays, Another column for the rabbinic holidays, Hanukkah and Purim, are there at the end during the winter time, the coming months. We have two rabbinic holidays, Hanukkah, and then 2 months later, we have the festival of Purim. This year it's going to be 4 months later because there's 2 Adars. Sometimes we get a double Adar and we celebrate Purim in the second Adar. So we have a longer break between those rabbinic festivals. But we're talking about Hanukkah now, and Hanukkah's in Kislev. It's a rabbinic holiday. And there's other commemorations. There's Pesach Sheni, Lag BaOmer, Tu B'Shvat. What is the title of this book? It says here. And laws of the minor holidays and annual observances. So there's this, I call them commemorations here. There's annual observances on other days too, and of course the fast days, which is its own column. But primarily we have 2 rabbinic holidays nowadays. If you consider Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim rabbinic holidays, we have those as well. Anyways, Megillat Ta'anit, this Tannaitic text from the sages, had even more rabbinic holidays. He just made a list. What was that, 5 different holidays? During the Second Temple era. During the Second Temple era, additional holidays. And they all went the way of the world. They all disappeared. The one remaining festival, well, 2 really. 2 that are mentioned there was Purim and Hanukkah. Hanukkah we continue to commemorate, and not the others. It's a little surprising. Why? Does Hanukkah make it, and the other ones didn't make it?
Where's the miracle?
So let's take a look. Continue reading, Yosef, he explains.
However, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the sages abolished Megillat Ta'anit, because all of the wonderful things that happened in those days were no longer relevant, and thus no longer constituted a reason to rejoice. One may even pass and deliver eulogies on these days. Only Hanukkah remains all of those days, as the sages explained, because of the unique miracle of the oil that it commemorates and the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles that the sages enacted to publicize the miracle. And since we already observed the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah candles, we also preserve the other aspects of the holiday. We thank Hashem by inserting Al HaNisim into our prayers. We praise Hashem for saving His people by reciting Hallel, and we refrain from fasting and eulogizing throughout the holiday. In order to understand better the significance of Hanukkah, the miracle of the oil, the only remnants of all the holidays that existed during the Second Temple era, we must elaborate a bit on the events of those days and their meaning.
Okay, so there's basically Hanukkah is representative of many holidays, which there were in the Second Temple era. But that once the Second Temple was destroyed, what are we going to celebrate? Continue to celebrate? So it's very surprising why Hanukkah we do celebrate, even though the Second Temple was destroyed. All those festival holidays were about successes of the Jewish people in the Second Temple period. Rebuilding this section, conquering that area, removing that foreign god, idol, all different types of conquests of the Hasmoneans. But they're all gone now. Second Temple was destroyed. Why should we celebrate them? And the truth is, it doesn't make sense. Why should we celebrate Hanukkah either? The Hasmoneans had some success, but it was all destroyed. Why do we still celebrate Hanukkah? There must be something special about Hanukkah that goes beyond the temporary success of those Second Temple era Jews in the land of Israel. There's something much more basic about this miracle, and that's symbolized by the miracle of the oil. No, none of the other holidays did they have such a commemoration, to light candles. Hanukkah was singled out already by the sages in the time of the miracle. It wasn't just any of those, like all those other Second Temple festivals. This was a special one. And because of that, it remains celebrated until today, even though we don't have a Second Temple already for almost 2,000 years. What are we celebrating essentially in Hanukkah? We celebrate, what does the word Chanukah mean? Dedication, that's right. It's about the dedication of the temple. The temple at one point was defiled and it was sanctified and dedicated. Dedicated means to started to inaugurate the use, once again, the reuse of the temple. So we're celebrating, it's a very temple-oriented holiday. But then that temple gets destroyed, only about 200 years later. So why should we celebrate it? That's our question. We're going to see that this idea of the dedication of that Second Temple era, in the middle of the Second Temple, it's not even the beginning of the Second Temple. It's the rededication of the Second Temple. When it got purified, this is what we celebrate. And with so many questions, don't you just want to get into it and try to understand why? What's so special about Hanukkah? What are we really celebrating? It can't just be that there was this historical event on this day and okay, rah, rah, rah. There were many historical events. The Jews always had successes, failures. There was this conquering, that. Something very special about Hanukkah, which the sages deemed to be eternal. Eternal. Until the end of days, we'll be celebrating this miracle of Hanukkah. Because some lights lit for 8 days, that's very cool. It's a very cool miracle. But because of that, you're going to put it on the same level as Sukkot and Pesach, festival for all time. So we have to understand what the deeper meaning of Hanukkah is, what the message is, which is so important that the sages said, even though the Second Temple gets destroyed, we're going to celebrate these days of the miracle of Hanukkah. In order to do that, we're going to learn some history. Hanukkah, how's your history? How's your Jewish history? Yeah? Yeah. You knew the answer, which came first, Hanukkah or Purim? It's always tricky to me. Purim was first, yeah. And which, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but we tried to get everybody here on the same page. Now, how's your knowledge of the literature that was written in the various eras? Like when was the Mishnah written? What is the Mishnah? That's something we're going to... That gets tricky, yeah, sure. Yeah, so many books, right. And then the Rambam, when did he live? And Rashi, and we'll try to get it straight here. We're going to focus in on the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire, our sages tell us that the sages who lived right after the time of during and after the Hasmonean period. This was really the period of the birth, you could say, of the centrality of the sages. The entire Second Temple era, we have a transition from the age of prophecy. First Temple is associated with prophecy. There were lots of prophets. Do you know any names of prophets?
Which Isaac,
First Temple.
Jeremiah.
Isaac is biblical. That's even before the First Temple. That's First Temple prophets. Amos, Joel, good. Yechezkel, Yeshayahu, right? Well, you guys are going esoteric on me. Give me some basics. Prophets of the First Temple. Shlomo is a king. Eliyahu, of course, stories about Eliyahu. Yeah. Shmuel.
Was he alive?
Of course. Shmuel helped King David plan. He helped him become king, and then he helped him plan the temple. According to our sages, there's a few references to how they were planning to build it. Obviously, King David himself did not get to inaugurate the temple. It was his son, Shlomo. By the time his son Shlomo was king, maybe Shmuel was no longer the prophet. We know that Natan was the prophet who was around when King David was passing on. We just read it in the Haftarah 2 weeks ago, right? In any case, so First Temple, there's lots of prophets. All the prophets that you know of are pretty much First Temple, except for a few that continue to prophesy at the beginning of the Second Temple era. Most famously, Ezra,
Malachi?
Malachi, that's right. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last three of the small ones. Of course, Esther, right? Esther, during the time of Purim, that was the beginning of the Second Temple era, and Mordechai, her cohort. Esther and Mordechai, they're considered prophets. So we had to, and Ezra and Nehemiah and all those, the beginning of the Second Temple era had some prophets. But then they stop. Pretty much our sages tell us that this channel of communication got stopped up or was discontinued. Maybe it's still sending out transmissions and we can't hear it.
The second temple
I don't
was built
know.
what year?
Second temple was built in minus 516. Right, the standard assumption is that the first temple was destroyed in minus 516, and then after 70 years later, is minus 586. I apologize. Minus 586 is when the second temple was inaugurated. No, the opposite. Yeah, I got it right the first time. Yeah.
So both will last like 500 years.
Approximately, exactly.
Spot on.
Exactly, approximately 500 years. There's some differences. It's a little complicated, but I try to keep it simple. 500 years. The first temple, yeah, we know King David was from around 1,000, right? King David and Solomon around the year 1,000, minus 1,000, and it gets destroyed minus 586. So that's almost 500 years. And then the second temple gets started 70 years later, 70 years of exile, as the prophet talked about, the Babylonian exile, and then they come back. So
510?
516. Just if you go from minus 586 to minus 516, that's a good number. Easy way to remember it. Anyways, Second Temple era. We had the little prophecy, and then who was the leadership? We said the men of the great assembly. Who were they? If they weren't prophets, they were sages. We called them sages. They were rabbinic leadership. There were the Kohanim as well, who took on prominence because of the centrality of the temple, centrality of the Second Temple. That was the center of a Jewish life, religious life. And so the Kohanim were there, but there were also the rabbis. So there's these groups of the rabbis and their teachings continuing to transmit the Torah in parallel to the prophets at the first, and then that was all that was left. Prominence of the rabbis gets bigger, and the rabbis, when they give us, they interpreted some of the prophecies for us also. The prophecies speak about the four kingdoms, right? In the book of Daniel, right? There's dreams.
Ezekiel.
Yeah, also Ezekiel. The four kingdoms. The four kingdoms we speak of in our tradition. We don't start with Egypt. Egypt is before the Jewish people were created. But after that, we're talking about the exiles. So we have the Babylonian exile, the first Babylon. After the Babylonian kings destroyed the first temple, but before that there was the Assyrians who exiled the 10 tribes. But Babylon, Persia, what happens? Alexander the Great, minus 333, conquers the land of Israel. So we have Greece being in control of the land of Israel. And finally, the fourth of the classic four empires, four kingdoms, is Rome. Towards the end of the Second Temple, we know that the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, and they took over once the Greek Empire disintegrated, the Roman Empire. And to some extent, in rabbinic literature, the Roman exile, the Roman Empire lasts until today. They don't really, Baruch Hashem, today we have Medinat Yisrael. Yeah, well, we know that the Roman Empire became the Byzantine. Byzantine is when the church took over the Roman Empire. So the next form of the Roman Empire was the Christian Roman Empire. And that lasted for hundreds of years also. But, what's Italy today? Barely have an economy that can be bolstered by lots of help. Anyways, all these empires are gone, came and went, and here we are, the Jewish people, reestablishing our state after thousands of years. In any case, obviously we're going to focus in on Greece. The Hanukkah story happened under the Greek influence. The Purim story happened under the Persian influence. So this is just a little bit of context. We're going to see more context tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem. If you have your charts of the 7 periods of Jewish history, I have a cheat sheet which we're going to review. But for now, let's get back to let's start with the Hanukkah story. Okay, Greek Empire. Yosef, take it away.
The Greek Empire. Over the course of hundreds of years, an advanced culture developed in Greece and accomplished a great deal in the realms of science, philosophy, literature, art, architecture, military strategy, and politics. Its power increased gradually. In defeating his adversaries, King Philip II of Macedon united the Greek city-states under his rule. He invited the great Greek philosopher and scientist Aristotle to tutor his son, Alexander III, later known as Alexander the Great. When Alexander ascended the throne, he began a campaign of conquest. Within 3 years, his army had conquered vast expanses of territory. Asia Minor, Eretz Israel, Egypt, and the entire mighty Persian Empire as far as India. After Alexander died, the generals of the Macedonian army began fighting over the throne. In the end, they divided the vast territory under their control into several Greek kingdoms.
Okay, so Alexander the Great, he was a wonderful figure, mythic in his vast military successes in a very short time. The Talmud has stories about Alexander, how he could fly. It's describing how he really was the greatest, maybe, military campaign in history. He's known as Alexander the Great. And, of course, his relations to Jews is what we're going to talk about, his conquering of the land of Israel. But with all of his greatness, I think he wasn't much more than 40. Don't remember precisely how old he was when he died, but he died abruptly. And then there was this vast empire that was all conquered by this great conqueror, Alexander. What happens then? So they divided it up. 3 generals, they were fighting over it. They decided to divide it up. This general gets this area. This general gets that area. We're going to focus on, there's 3. Okay, there's 3 major ones. You have a map. We have a map here on the wall. If you can see, it's a little small. Here's the land of Israel. Okay. So of course, here's Italy with the boot. I know you can't see it, but I'll make it a color. I'll scratch off the gray, and you see the little red boot of Italy. So that's where it started. So one of the generals, Greece, it's right next to it, not far. Greece. From there, it conquered all of Europe. One general was given all of what we today call Europe. Another general was given the eastern part, what was Persia, all the way over to India, all the way over. All this area was given to a second general. Primarily, its headquarters was in Syria. Sometimes they're called the Syrian Greeks. They have a name called the Seleucids. Seleucid. In Hebrew, many times they say Selevkim. That's a corruption of Seleucid. I don't know what it is in original in Greek. I don't know. But this is it's easy to remember. This is the Syrian. You see the S's help us remember that. That's so we have the European. I don't know what the Greek name for Europe was at that time, but I think it.
Europe is from Greek. It's
Yeah.
no, actually Europe is a Phoenician name, but
Okay. And then the third group, the third general, right? 3 generals. He was named, I believe his name was Ptolemy. The P is silent. He got, go back to the map, he got the southern part of the empire, from Eretz Israel down to the south. All of Africa that was conquered by Alexander, there was 3 prongs. The European prong, the eastern prong, and the southern prong. And so we have, for our purposes, where is the land of Israel? Smack in the middle. And it changed hands. At the beginning, Eretz Israel was under the Egyptian. First, it was under the Egyptian control. Ptolemaic control. They're all Greeks. This is all part of the Greek Empire. But it got divided up. So we have the Ptolemaic Greeks, and then for the first 150 years. So from minus 333, we go to minus 233, and we go to about minus 185. Year minus 185, we got switched, and they fought between them, and the land of Israel, stuck in the middle, became under the purvey of the Seleucid Greeks, the Syrian Greeks. And this is where the trouble started. The story of Hanukkah happens when the Syrian Greeks, as opposed to the Ptolemaic Greeks, they decided to persecute us religiously. Up until that point, it started off quite rosy. Alexander the Great, we're going to hear about how he had a meeting with the rabbinic leader, probably Shimon HaTzadik, one of the members, the last of the 120 men of Great Assembly. Actually, I'll tell you about it soon. But there was life, Jewish life in the temple. The Jews were allowed to continue their lifestyle for 150 years when they were under the Ptolemaic Greeks. But then, when the Syrian Greeks took over, not the first, but the second of the kings who was in charge of the land of Israel, he turned the screws, tried to Hellenize. Helen was a Greek princess. And that's representative of the Greek culture. They tried to enforce the culture and stamp out Judaism from the Jews, and that's when we get into the trouble. But let's keep reading. We'll see. The Hellenists is those purveyors of Greek culture, which started into the land in minus 333. But we survived, we lived with it for 150 years. Fascinating. Until they tried to push us against the wall and tried to destroy Judaism totally. And then we had to rebel. And that's where we get to the story of Hanukkah. But let's see how he presents it. We are on page 223, the end of the paragraph that ends up with, in the end, they divided the vast Torah under the control into several Greek kingdoms. I think he doesn't get into all of the details. Maybe in the next section he will. but I gave you a little more background. Okay, as a result of the conquest. Chanoch, will you read for us, please, the next paragraph? As a result of the conquest.
Judah was among the areas ruled by the Greeks.
One paragraph before that, please.
Oh, okay. As a result of the conquest, Greek culture spread throughout the world, consuming all other cultures and forming a single Hellenistic civilization. The system of government, language, culture, and sporting competitions in every country were Hellenistic. The upper classes and the nobility of every land assimilated into Hellenistic culture, imitated its ways.
Until today, by the way, some people say we think in Greek patterns of thought. It was very pervasive, this Greek culture. Go ahead.
Judah was among the areas ruled by the Greeks, and there too Hellenism spread. The Jews, however, were different from the other nations, and the process of Hellenization proceeded relatively slowly in Judah. Nonetheless, over the course of 160 years of Greek rule, the influence of the Hellenists grew increasingly stronger. Mostly over the affluent, it reached the point where the high priest, Jason and Menelaus, were leading supporters of Hellenization. Working to increase Greek influence in Judah, Jason built a gymnasium near the Holy Temple, which caused the priests to prefer watching wrestling matches rather than performing their sacrificial duties in the temple.
Wow. I heard that there is some shuls where on Super Bowl Sunday they have in the lobby of the shul they have a screening, or maybe even on Saturday, on the Pro Bowls. They know that people they want to watch visions of the Jason, the Hellenistic high priest.
Is it Jason the Argonauts?
Sorry?
Is it Jason the Argonauts? The famous Jason of the Golden Fleece and all these.
I don't know all the stories about him. I'm not so familiar with it, but he's known. A lot of this comes from the Book of the Maccabees. There he's called Yason. Yason is Jason. It's just a Greek name. There are, I don't know which stories you're referring to, so I can't answer your question. So we don't know. We don't know, but there were people at close to the time. It's sort of like a Jewish version of the history of the times. There's also, of course, Josephus, the Roman, who's a Jew under Roman influence, who wrote a history. He was closer to the times, right? Rome took over for the Greeks, so he knew a little bit about, it's just 150 years before that. So he gave us some of these stories. But the closest sources that we have to the times are the Book of the Maccabees, even though they weren't written on those years either. Most scholars say it was 100 years afterwards as well. But anyways, they do tell us we have quite a lot of history about the Second Temple time from these two major sources, and there's some other external historical sources as well from Rome. But we know about the names of the various high priests, and especially, as we're going to see, the Hasmonean rule, when the Jews kick out the Greek rulers and they create a Jewish rule. We have a lot of that history as well. But this is before that time. Okay, so Jason. Okay, so during the Hellenistic time. Okay, in the year, continue, Chanoch. Thank you.
In the year 3591, from creation, 169 BC, around 160 years after the Greeks conquered Eretz Israel,
Antiochus is the way we usually pronounce it. Yeah, the fourth, yeah.
Epiphanes began oppressing the Jews. Under his rule, the Greeks plundered the holy vessels of the temple, breached the walls of Jerusalem, murdered thousands of Jews, and enslaved many others. In 3593, 167 BC, Antiochus decreed that the Jews must forsake the Torah and its mitzvahs and worship idols. He made it a capital crime to perform mitzvahs, abolished the sacrificial service in the temple, and turned the temple into a place of idolatry. Torah scrolls were torn and burned, and Antiochus soldiers went from town to town, forcing the Jews to eat pork and erect an altar for idol worship. They prohibited the practice of Brit Milah, and Jewish women who insisted on circumcising their sons were executed. As a result of these decrees, many pious Jews fled to the wilderness, caves, or other countries, and many were murdered in sanctification of God's names.
Let me stop for a second. What do we call these? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead a little more. Yeah, please.
The intense pressure that the Greeks exerted against the Jews kindled a spark in their souls, and when the Greeks arrived in the village of Bodin with the intention of forcing Mattiyahu the Yohanan, the high priest, to worship idols, Mattiyahu rose up and killed the Greek officer and his Hellenized Jewish collaborators. The novelty of his action was that instead of dying in sanctification of God's name like the other pious Jews, he decided to kill the oppressor. By doing so, he and his sons raised the banner of rebellion against the Greeks and Hellenization.
Yeah, keep going.
The war was difficult.
This is an overview of the story.
The boldness of Mattiyahu's son led the fighters. With courage and skill, the Hasmoneans overcame the Greek forces, and after 2 years of fighting, they succeeded in conquering Jerusalem. On the 25th of Kislev, 3596, 165 BC, they began purifying the temple and restoring the sacrificial service to its original state. This is when the miracle of the oil took place. Later on, the Greeks returned to Eretz Israel in greater numbers, conquered Yerushalayim, and put Hellenized Kohanim in charge of the temple. However, in order to avoid increasing tensions with the Jews, they abolished the evil decrees and allowed the Jews to observe the Torah and the mitzvahs. But this did not stop the rebellion. The Hasmoneans continued to fight against the Greeks and Hellenism. The war effort had ups and downs, but the Hasmonean brothers combined strength, diplomacy, and cunning to eventually gain political independence. Decades later, granted the Jews lived under the aegis of the mighty empires of the ancient world, first the Greeks and then the Romans, but rule over Eretz Israel was by the Jews and for the Jews.
Okay, so yeah, quite a story. Keep going. One more paragraph.
So it seems quite evident that had the Greeks been more patient, Judah would have succumbed to Hellenism, just like the other nations did. But the hand of God, which conceals itself in the historical process, generated the conflict. Just as he hardened Pharaoh's heart during the Exodus, so too he hardened Antiochus' heart, and in the process helped reveal the faith, self-sacrifice, and courage of the Jewish people.
Wow. Okay, so the extreme religious persecution is what made us rebel and what helped us survive, as opposed to all the other cultures around us who pretty much became influenced by Greek culture and disappeared. And they lost their faith and their culture. And the Greek culture was so pervasive. He uses this term. We have the Hellenists. As I said, Helen.
Couple minutes?
Sure. The Hellenists, and they were fighting against, what did we say? Hasmoneans. What's that name mean? Where does it come from? Right, the Hashmonaim. So nobody really knows. It could be it's the name of a place. It is a name of the place in the Torah. But some people say because it represents what they fought for. The Chet stands for Chodesh. Chodesh means the new month. Shin stands for Shabbat. And Mem stands for Milah. These are the three Jewish rituals which the Antiochus outlawed. So we're going to be the Chodesh, Shabbat, and Milah people. We're going to fight for our religious freedom. Maybe that's why they're called Hashmonaim. Another name for them is, of course, the Maccabees. And that's because they were good at sports. Aha, right? Maccabi Tel Aviv. Maccabi, we're not sure where that name comes from either. Some people say that's also an acronym. Mem stands for me, Chaf kamocha, like you, Ba'ilim, Hashem, and Yud stands for the beginning of Hashem's name. So Hashem. Who is like you among the gods? Hashem. So it's also a battle cry, a religious battle cry. But these are the names of our heroes who are rebelling against the Greek Empire and the culture of the Greek Empire, which is Hellenism. Okay, we have to stop here. Yehuda Cohen's coming. Maybe he'll talk to you also.